Dear all, clearly we have to rethink human exceptionalism and the human condition at large. Arguably, we are kind of entering a post-human condition in three ways instead. So, for instance, we are first recognizing climate change and environmental agency as key for our own existence as ecological beings. But also, secondly, by recognizing other kinds of animals as unique social beings. And thirdly, by incorporating artificial intelligences as integral parts of our social interaction and letting algorithms guide our sociability. So this is what we are dealing with when we do more than human humanities and feminist posthumanities with the Posthumanities Hub. My name is Cecilia Åsberg. I'm a professor at Gender Nature Culture at Linköping University, and until very recently, a guest professor at KTH. And I have the great honor of welcome you all warmly as the head of the Posthumanities Hub. And the Posthumanities Hub acts as a research group and a cross-university platform for the new humanities and the arts of sustainability. And I'm super proud to welcome you all and to welcome you all to this event. Together with you all and my colleagues at KTH, Lina Rahm and Adam Wickberg. Now, please, Adam, tell us more about what we want to do with the Hub and AI.
Thank you, Cici. Yes, my name is Adam Wickberg. We'll say a brief word about myself as well. I'm at KTH, as Cici said, working on media and environment in a broad sense, from early modern to AI, looking into how media affect environment. I'm also part of the Hub team, and I'm also working on a large project at KTH called The Mediated Planet, claiming data for environmental SDGs, where we look at media technologies, data processing, and AI in relation to SDGs 13 to 15 on climate, ocean, and biodiversity. And I'm extremely happy to be here today and gather so many brilliant people working on AI and humanities. And we think of this event as a teaser. There's more to come. So this event is just for people to see what other people are doing, and we're planning to establish a network on AI and the new humanities, which all of you speakers are warmly welcome to join. And we hope that many of you will. And in the continuity of that network, we're also planning an edited volume. So we're hoping that we will receive some abstracts from you, but you'll get more details of that later on after the event. But a lot more to come, and this is the first thing in this collaboration. Yes, Lina, give the word to you to give some more.
Thank you, Adam. So I'm Lina, and I'm currently a postdoc at KTH, and I'm also very proud to be part of the Posthumanities Hub. So my research is focused on the structural and political ways that technology and anticipations of technology shapes the ideal citizen, and what kind of inclusion, exclusion, and intersecting oppression that this results in. Another way to say it is, how does AI implicate what knowledge is, and in the long run, which individual that is seen as desirable? So, seeing how the current virus pandemic has been framed so much about data, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge how many feminist, post-colonial, critical race scholars and activists have pointed out how data-driven systems, AI system and autonomous system, are also used to reproduce the matrix of domination, and specifically harm Black and Brown people, Indigenous people, trans and gender non-conforming people, disabled people, immigrants, and people in the intersection of all those unifying signifiers. This is done through, for example, risk assessment, face recognition, and many other different systems of policing. So this is a shout out to all those who are actively tackling such issues. Check out these chat. I'll post them in this site. I'll post them in the chat as well. And please feel free to add all those we've missed to acknowledge in the chat. So the reason we invited you all here today is that you are a great inspiration to us. And we basically wanted to get you all together, as Cici and Adam say, to know more about your work. We realize, of course, that everyone's time is really fractioned these days. So we very much appreciate that you're making the time for us to make this happen. Thank you. Today, we have 10 brilliant speakers. All of the scholars here today will present themselves and their work in a quick row, 5 minutes per person. So friends, this is going to be intense. Buckle up. However, since we don't have room for questions right after each presentation, please post them in the chat and we'll gather them and address all the questions after all presentations. So we're going to introduce the speakers right before they speak. And the first speaker is Johannes Bruder. Johannes is a researcher at the Institute of Experimental Design and Media Cultures and the Critical Media Lab in Basel. Bruder's current research interests include interaction between psychological research and computing, AI, narratives and dispositives of creative practice, and media studies of psychic life. So Johannes, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Lina, for inviting me to this exciting workshop. I'm super eager to hear more of everyone's work and ideas today. I myself am a sociologist, and I should probably share my screen. There we go. A sociologist, and I started researching artificial intelligence after doing an STS study of computational neuroscience as a PhD candidate. I wasn't originally interested in AI specifically. My work focused more on coders that help neuroscientists investigate the human brain. But when I did fieldwork in neuroscience labs in the UK at the beginning of the last decade, I was briefly in touch with Demis Hassabis, who had just founded DeepMind and submitted his PhD at UCL. Our interaction didn't really go anywhere then, but 4 years later, I stumbled upon the news that he had just sold DeepMind to Google for a reported 400 million British pounds. DeepMind has since made waves in the world of AI. For instance, AlphaGo thrashed a human world champion at Go, and its peers learned to master all sorts of legacy Atari games. They also lowered the energy bill of Google data centers and purportedly solved the 50-year-old puzzle of protein folding. I got interested since DeepMind refers to the domain as neuroscience-inspired AI and superhuman intelligence. And I asked myself, what does it mean to be superhuman and what sort of intelligence undergirds it? I would like to very briefly walk you through 2 case studies to try and provide you with a preliminary answer to that question. First, in their neuroscience-inspired AI, DeepMind draws heavily on resting state research in cognitive neuroscience, which in a nutshell tries to get at central aspects of human subjectivity and consciousness by scanning brains when bodies rest. The resting state research surged when concepts such as post-Fordist or cognitive capitalism were en vogue. It brought cognitive phenomena like daydreaming and mind-wandering into the focus of cognitive neuroscience, and it established that human brains actually never rest. DeepMind draws on these insights to try and optimize an allegedly disembodied intelligence that runs entirely within the cloud. The idea, in short, is if there is no body that needs to rest, we only need to simulate sleep to leave the narrow if-then highway, so characteristic of traditional computing. Of course, restless algorithms in the cloud means restlessness for those who care for servers and data centers. Maya Ganesh and I delved into job ads for data center engineers to determine what human support roles might look like. The most significant capabilities indeed are being able to lift 50 plus pounds over your head and not needing daylight or any other people to talk to for days. Another superhuman capacity we guessed definitely your capacity to mind wander effectively might come in handy here. But I'd like to walk you through it in another scene, namely that one of DeepMind has been most successful in, and that is video games. As you all know, board and video games are often used as testbeds in product showcases in AI, and DeepMind emphasized the demo qualities of legacy Atari video games. And they have proposed to use high scores as benchmarks that determine whether or not an agent is intelligent. The algorithms indeed managed to outscore all human players, partly thanks to the familiarity of many coders with the technocultural practice of video gaming. I've never been particularly intrigued by video games myself, but what I remember quite well is that finding and using cheats was one of the most significant skills there. And indeed, if you think past high scores and benchmarks, artificial agents exhibit a remarkable creativity in winning without actually solving the task. So there's a flurry of examples where agents simply find ways to cheat better than humans. For instance, in Montezuma's Revenge, which you see on the slide, an artificial agent found a way to stay in the treasure room and amass endless amount of capital without advancing to the next level. And I'd like to end on this example and on the note that superhuman intelligence, especially in my case, appears to be an overemphasis on a specific human educated in the global north at the close of the 20th century. Superhuman intelligence is thus not post-human, it is inward-facing and protective of an understanding of the human that, as video games would suggest, follows settler colonial motives, and as the idea of post-forest capitalism would suggest, should aspire to never really rest. And I'm personally not a humanist, I would say, but I think that studying the human implemented in technocultural infrastructures and imaginaries can be a step towards thinking the human differently from there on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Johannes, for a brilliant presentation, very intriguing. I'm sure there are a lot of questions from all of you, but as we've said, please write them down in the chat or come back in the discussion and we will talk more to Johannes about these interesting aspects. Now we're moving on quickly to Teresa Serrato-Pargman. She is an associate professor of human-computer interaction at Stockholm University. Her research is situated at the intersection of educational technology and human-computer interaction. It seeks to contribute to the study of the increasing digitalization of everyday practices and mainly to reflect on the opportunities and challenges that this process brings to epistemic and social practices in education. She is also the PI of the WASP-HS, that is the Wallenberg Autonomous Systems Program, that the Swedish people in the room at least will know of. Those of you who are not from Sweden, this is the biggest, research funding scheme on AI that is funded by the Wallenberg Foundation. Her project with them is called Ethical and Legal Challenges in Relationship to AI-Driven Practices in Higher Education. The floor is yours, Teresa. You are muted. Sorry.
Mute. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for the presentation. It's a pleasure to be here together with you. This is a project that is focused on the ethical and legal challenges of artificial intelligence driven practices in higher education. And I'm running this project together with Professor Cecilia Åsberg and other colleagues at Stockholm University. And we bring together different competences from the educational science, human-computer interaction, and legal informatics. When we talk about artificial intelligence, of course, we are talking about data and analytics, but more precisely, we are talking about learning analytics. And we have a specific focus on predictive analytics because they are quite controversial. And these systems are fascinating and intriguing for us because they are presented as the one which are going to solve so many problems in education, especially the discourse as a focus on learning analytics is going to identify students at risk, improve the quality and value of the learning experience, supporting self-regulated learning, and so on. So what's the problem then? Everything looks so nice. The issue that is important for us is thing that I summarize in this quote: just because you can access and store and analyze the student data or teachers' data, that's not mean that you should. So there are key ethical considerations and legal considerations that we have to pay attention. And you probably have seen the research community as nowadays has been mobilized, and there is a lively debate about the power of these algorithms of oppression, how they are automating inequality. So, and of course, in the educational sector, there is also this concern that this analytics, these learning analytics systems will, instead of open new opportunities for the students, will close them down. So how we look, or the lens that we use to look at these ethical and legal challenges is a relational lens. We look at these challenges at the intersection of what we call matters of social justice and matters of care. So we are connecting to the principles, this normative documents that have to do with ensuring the fair and equitable treatment of all people, but at the same time, we connect with these values, the values that we would like to see underpinning the development, the design, the deployment of these systems in the in education here in the Nordic countries. So more specifically, when we talk about ethics, and there is so much on ethics, right? We take this particular point of view, that is, we talk about ethics as ethics are situated, right? So ethics are always from somewhere. Ethics are not universal, but connected to a specific perspective or position that operates within power relationships, entrenched in artifacts, document discourses. So we want to make this specific perspective more clear. Let's see, we also engage with this objectivity myth about data, right? And that's important because this is a discourse that is very, very present in higher education nowadays when we talk about evidence-based learning, or that institutions will make decisions based on data. So that's important for us to dissect and unpack all these assumptions about data being neutral, being not political, etc., etc. The ambition with the project, and I'm finishing with that, is to make a contribution, to make a conceptual contribution to theorization of ethical considerations. We are interested in ethics, everyday ethics, ethics from the ground. Empirically, we want to contribute with methods, with novel methods to unpack these questions, and pragmatically. So we want to do something. So we are bringing together different stakeholders that need to talk about values in higher education. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is the advisory board. Thank you. So.
Thank you so much. Incredible. Do you all have questions for Teresa? Please post them in the chat. So next up, we're going to hear from Andre Holzapfel, who is an associate professor at the Media Technology and Interaction Design Department at KTH, Stockholm. He's currently the PI of the WASP-HS-funded project AI and the Artistic Imaginary, Social Cultural Consequences and Challenges of Creative AI Technology. So take it away, Andre.
Okay, thank you. So, yeah, I'm taking the opportunity to present basically the project that we are going to work on, AI and the Artistic Imaginary. socio-cultural consequences, and challenges of creative AI technology. This project has the motivation, or starts from the motivation, that we think that AI will foreground the modification of
Dear Andre, you have actually accidentally turned off your microphone.
That's really weird. Now you can hear me. Because I unmuted me at the beginning, so something happened here.
Yes, we heard you first. Then you were unmuted one slide into the presentation.
This is really weird. I mean, I did not click anything, but
there is this automatic function actually. If you touch the space bar, it can actually mute you.
Okay, I did not know about that. Let's hope that happens not again. Let me know if it happens again. Anyway, okay. Okay, let me just start again with the motivation of our project, that AI will foreground the mass commodification of art beyond reproduction and distribution, namely the automated creation of arts. And our objectives in this project are then to survey and analyze contemporary practices and future application scenarios of AI in art, and then to assess the environmental sustainability of current and envisioned creative AI applications when they are applied on a large and global scale. And finally, to reshape existing ethical guidelines and propose alternative directions for future intellectual property right frameworks for creative AI. So quite an ambitious agenda, I would say. The project has an associated project also, Creative AI, Sustainable and Legitimate Practice, that gives us a second PhD. And both projects are funded by the WASP-HS. So we are 4 faculty involved and 2 PhDs to be hired. And we have an associated think tank for creative AI that is going to be established, and to which interested researchers are very, very welcome and invited. And we are starting now with the first mapping of the quite huge terrain. So our team is then me as the PI with a background both in engineering and in ethnomusicology. Cecilia, whom you all know, I assume. And then we have further on Bob Sturm, associate professor at KTH, working on music informatics, and Daniel Parkman, an expert in HCI and sustainability. Our methods in this project, so we aim to advance a forecasting analysis of the ontology of creative AI through the following methods: design fiction workshops to collaboratively shape scenarios in which AI may be used for the creation of arts; practice-based research, which is used to gauge the impact of AI creations on human artistic practice; virtual field work, which will study the actions and interactions of stakeholders; sustainability assessment, to evaluate the environmental sustainability of our scenarios; and finally, a critical methods or critical methods to engage equitable models for copyright protections and remuneration practices. So this is one of the first systematic endeavors to situate ethical and legal frameworks of AI applied to the arts on a diverse empirical basis. We think that the shaping of sustainable creative AI is an essential condition for future artists to thrive on a larger scale and on a diverse basis. And we hope that we will provide a rich knowledge base for the future development of AI-based creative products through our project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. That was a really interesting presentation with a lot of things that we can come back to in the discussion. And again, I encourage you to use the chat, write questions, and we will come back to this. There are many different aspects that I think tie into other speakers' presentation as well. And yes, great. We got a question now from Teresa. So please, everyone, use the chat if you have any ideas or thoughts or comments to the speakers, and we'll pick them up. But now we are quickly moving on, as we have said, and we are now giving the word to Åsa Johansson Palmqvist. She is a PhD student in gender, organization, and technology in the Department of Industrial Economics and Management at KTH. Her PhD project aims at exploring how AI research links to the inclusion and exclusion of different people and enables and restricts specific ways of existing in this world. So with that, I give the word to you, Åsa.
So thank you. Can you hear me?
We hear you, yes.
Good. Yeah, I'm very excited to being part of this. Thank you for organizing it. It's been very exciting to hear about the previous presentations. I will present my thesis project, which is a feminist study of AI research with the working title, Making Mastermind Machines. And this project is very much shaped by my background experiences and interest. 15 to 20 years ago, I was an engineering student, took a course for CICI in gender and technology, which very much transformed the way I saw technology as something that produced gendered relations. And since then, I've been working in the medical technology field, done some detouring in creative writing, and then always with these questions in mind. So then going back to academia, and I see feminist technoscience very much as and posthumanism as a way of combining my interest in technology and feminism and writing. And when I started my PhD, I was very intrigued by how all of a sudden everyone talked about AI, and it was very much in the media about various utopian and dystopian visions of the future, and technology celebrities like Elon Musk even warning about AI eliminating humanity. And all of a sudden, a lot of money was also thrown at these new fields of technology, or not so new, but under this label of AI. But in parallel to this, more and more reporting was also about how implemented AI systems actually reinforced quite familiar inequalities. Here's a picture of Joy Bulambini, who addressed how facial recognition systems do not recognize the female or Black women to the extent of white men, for example. And oftentimes a link was made to the male dominance in terms of number in the AI field. So the massive influence of AI in terms of attention and economic investments in combination with the science of gender and other inequalities was what kind of got me into this project. And the aim of my project is to map how AI research is enacting AI, and in particular with focus on how this co-produces different types of inequalities. And I also want to explore how this can, opportunities to make make AI that is more inclusive, both in terms of who can actually work in these organizations, but ultimately that we get AI that enables a world for more of us. And I draw on feminist studies, feminist technoscience studies, but also feminist organization studies. And the point of departure is very much about how organizations and technology are co-producers of gender. It's an ethnographic study. I follow two university departments that are linked to a major Swedish AI initiative. I have done mostly interviews and observations with men and women in different stages of their careers who are involved in robotics, computer vision, and machine learning, and automatic control. And I look at different aspects and practices of their research, how they define AI, how the AI is divided into different disciplines and fields, what methods they use, and how they envision AI's role in the world, what competence are deemed necessary to do this kind of technology, and also how they explain the inequalities. And ultimately, or hopefully, my project will offer a piece of the puzzle to understand how AI research links to the inclusion and exclusion of different people, enables and restricts specific ways of existing in this world. And these are insights that can be used to develop requirements on the AI field in order to make possible AI technologies and a world for more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. It really feels like we're sort of marching on here, but we're getting so much to think about after each presentation, and hopefully this will spur some discussions afterwards. So next up, I'm thrilled to announce Cecilia Åsberg, who is a professor and subject director of law and information technology at the Swedish Law and Informatics Research Institute, Stockholm University. She has extensive experience of legal system design and management, giving rise to issues about cybersecurity. So I'm going to turn it over to you and also share your PowerPoint.
Yes. Thank you. Can you hear me? Thumbs up.
Yes.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this very exciting event. I asked Lina or someone else to manage my slides in order not to have too much an impact on the tight time slot. Quite understandable though. Yes, so currently, thank you for the kind presentation. And currently I'm engaged in Teresa, the project that Teresa is managing. And also another collaborative project together with KTH about what's called data leash. It has to do with how to manage personal data, safeguarding privacy, combining legal aspects with software approaches, etc. What I'll address today briefly, though, is what I've labeled as the digital person, a new legal entity, ? Emphasized actually, on the role of law in an AI-based society. So can I have the next slide, please? Or maybe I can just, Lina, thank you, yes, and one, super. So it's all about personhood and historical developments. We began having in our society natural persons in terms of biological, physical ones, and then increasingly there was a need for some supplementary roles that we commonly in our daily life refer to as a legal person, and there are different kinds or categories of legal persons. And now what I find quite interesting, thrilling actually, is whether there is reason to introduce a new role in terms of a digital person in order not to end up with losses if passive when, for instance, transactions are not legally recognized, when an intelligent agent applied is neither received as a natural nor a legal person. So it's a risk-based awareness referred to as a digital person. And next slide, please. Yes, and I choose to refer to in the discussion and analysis to a digital person. You could talk about a digital entity and a digital figure. The label as such is not important, but rather the functionalities of that entity. It has implications with regard to certain rights and responsibilities, and what I just said about risk that will end up in some kind of dysfunctional legal society if or when no one takes the role of the subject. What we see as increasing examples that definitely give rise to some concerns has to is the very well-known example of self-driving car and associated liability and responsibility. We also have as a research object, privacy algorithms on the competitive market, and of course, data protection when it comes to profiling of not least consumers, and last but not the least, how to deal with openness and transparency in digital environments. Is it good enough to refer to digital to legal persons? Next slide, please. And in the context of digital persons, there are no doubt AI implications. And from a legal point of view, I just want to point to you that what we are in particular interested in the area of legal informatics and research has to do, no surprise, predictive modeling, text classifications. Law is very much about text, language technology. Of course, machine learning is a study object from a legal point of view in itself, profile, and so forth. And furthermore, I would just like to point out the importance of analysis from an analytical point of view, see to what extent it's important, relevant to make a distinction between conventional automation and AI on the other hand. And of course, yes, there is, in terms of legal implication when it comes to a static algorithm as opposed to a dynamic one with self-learning capacities. Yes, please, next slide. Reflections, and these are very, very subjective, but in a discussion about digital personhood, and more focused in terms of a digital person or some other kind of label, there is a quest for proactive reasoning. And furthermore, something that I've experienced quite surprisingly, that people, in terms of my professional colleagues, not the least, to some extent in the research community in general, but also in the daily debate in newspapers, digital news sources. People to a considerable extent are provoked by the mere suggestion of a digital person. And there are surprisingly prestigious reactions. People sometimes get angry at me. I'm somehow turning things upside down. I don't know how to really carry out research without perspective, but it strikes me that somehow quite a few professionals, media, etc., are provoked. Well, as good as it is, there is no reason to go on. What will be the advantages? There will be most disadvantages. But then if you make an historical reflection, there must be a similar point in history when when the physical, biological person wasn't sufficient enough. So that's kind of a soft aspect from a lawyer when it comes to a discussion about digital persons as a supplement to natural and legal ones. And then our final slide, please, Lina, is just a list of references, and I placed in bold two chapter contributions that I made that are explicitly focusing on digital persons. And then if you're interested, some general legal sources. But in those two chapters, I investigate a bit more into the legal applications, AI oriented, in connection with digital persons. So that was that. Thank you very much. So we can close the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. That was a really interesting presentation, and so many ways to look at these ethics and equitable aspects of AI from a legal perspective. I think we can definitely come back to that in many ways, and as before, keep on posting your questions in the chat, since we are moving on to our next speaker now, which is Simon Natal. He is an associate professor at the University of Turin in Italy and an assistant editor of the journal Media, Culture and Society. Simon's research focused broadly on media history, media theory, and digital media, and he's the author of 2 monographs, one of which just came out, I think like a month ago, called Deceitful Media, Artificial Intelligence and Social Life After the Turing Test. I have not had a chance to read it yet, but it looks super interesting, and we're keen on hearing what you're offering to us today. Simon, go.
Thank you very much. I'm sharing my screen. Yes, I'd like to thank you, Adam and Lina and Cecilia and Mariette and everybody else who contributed to organizing this great event. So thank you very much. It's a particular pleasure for me to be here, also because my little sister Irene actually took her master degree at KTH a couple of years ago. So there is a sort of family connection. So and it's another reason why I'm happy to be here. In my brief presentation, I will present some so the key argument from my book. So there is a tendency, I believe, in public debates about AI to privilege big metaphysical questions, such as the question if AI will reach consciousness, or if it will be possible to create machines that equal or exceed the intelligence of humans, or if a conflict might start between humans and robots. I believe, however, that this focus on such a big metaphysical question sometimes does not help us to consider other kinds of questions that might at first glance look smaller or more ordinary, but are equally, if not maybe even more important. My research asked this kind of question, and namely, I try to ask what are the dynamics and situations that lead humans to project humanity and project intelligence and project agency onto machines. Posing such a question means acknowledging that artificial intelligence should be defined not in absolute terms, but rather in relational terms. And to understand better what I mean with this, I can take the example of the Turing test, which was proposed as widely known by the British mathematician Alan Turing in 1950. So Turing started the paper where he proposed the Turing test by posing the question, can machines think? So a big question. But then, immediately after posing this question, he dismissed this very same question because he reasoned that it would be useless or even absurd to ask such a question because we couldn't find an agreement about the meaning of the word thinking and even about the meaning of the word machine. So he proposed to substitute this question, can machines think, with another kind of question, which is actually an experiment, an experience, the Turing test. The Turing test works in the following way. A human interrogator, here is C, enters in written communication, like in a chat room, with either a computer or a human. And the interrogator is to find out if she or he is talking with a human or a computer. If the computer is able to trick the interrogator into believing that it is a human, then it will have passed the Turing test. Now, although the Turing test is usually discussed as a threshold to assess the proficiency of AI, arguably, its most important implication is that we shouldn't seek an absolute definition of AI, but instead we should define AI and understand AI from the point of view of the observer, which is us, the humans. So already in 1950, Turing understood that the so-called intelligence of machines is first and foremost an effect that the computers may produce in the perception of human users. In this case, the interrogator of in the Turing test, who may or may not attribute intelligence and agency to machines. So in my book, The Deceitful Media, which just came out with Oxford University Press, as Adam kindly mentioned, I address the implication of such point, of such discovery, by looking at the history of AI from its very origins to contemporary technologies such as Siri and Alexa. I discuss and examine how the development of AI always built also on knowledge about how users respond to machines exhibiting intelligence. And I propose the concept of banal deception to describe the subtle ways in which AI technologies mobilize our perception, intellect, and imagination to achieve significant effects. Now, my time is over, so I will shut up, but I'd like to thank you so much for your attention and time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. This was really, really exciting. And I think this is ground for many, many questions and further discussions afterwards. And thank you for pointing out the importance of not just turning to these conventional, big metaphysical questions, but actually dealing with the effects of this in real life. And it's my great pleasure now to introduce to you all the next speaker, Jesper Olsson. So Jesper is a long-standing colleague and friend and professor at Linköping University. And Jesper's research explores the relationship between literature, art, and media, from phonographs to digital networks. And he approaches media as ecologies and infrastructures in culture, society, and everyday life. Olsson is, Jesper, is leading a number of research projects, including the Linköping University Research Group Literature, Media, Histories, and Information Cultures that are covering questions of archives and databases, distribution and transmission, noise and meaning, inter and transmedial art, media technologies, and cultural memory, media technologies and the history of the senses, biomedia, appropriation, remediation, trans and post literacy. With that, a warm welcome to you, Jesper.
Thank you so much, Cici, for those words. I think I'm unmuted, right? Yes. I'm also going to share the screen with you here. There you go. Yes, I'm going to say a few. Thank you so much for the invitation and for this wonderful and interesting gathering and conversation around AI. I'm going to say a few words here today about my current research project. Actually, there are two running now, but I will skip the one on fish, even though it brings up the Japanese game Seaman with an AI in the shape of a human fish, or fish human, rather, I would say. Anyway, my current project that I want to present engages with literature and ecology in an expanded sense, building on the notions of a general ecology and an ecologization of thinking and being as proposed by the German media historian Erich Hörl. Important here is then to consider not only the organic and natural domains, of course, but also media infrastructures, science systems, biogeochemical flows, and so on, and how these connect with and shape bodies and practices, human and non-human. In this project, I read and discuss various kinds of literature and some art from the last half century or so, from sound poetry to experimental novels, sci-fi and cli-fi. For instance, I've been writing on the intermingling of artifice and nature, hard steel and soft bodies in the post-beat novel by Richard Brautigan, Trout Fishing in America, and there the fish comes back again. On the mutations of language and media practices in recent post-apocalyptic fiction, and on microbes, clouds, and code in contemporary poetry by Adam Dickinson and others. In this setting, literature functions as a kind of archaeological probe, even though it is shaped and partially determined by discourse, to use that term. Its aesthetic operations open up for readings that can disclose historical and material layers of our post-humanist present, to use the words of Hurl. And especially here, I elaborate on the tension in literature between expressivity and artifice, between human and non-human. To approach the question of AI then more head-on, recently I decided to insert into this project some earlier work on literature, algorithms, and AI that I've been doing, actually leading back to a discussion of an algorithmic imagination that I did in my PhD thesis already in 2005. There are then at least three different aspects of how literature and AI meet and merge that I'm interested in pursuing and exploring. Firstly, then, literary representations of AI, and especially somewhat earlier ones, since they multiply quickly today. For instance, a work such as Richard Powers' novel about neural networks and machine learning, Galatea 2.2 from 1995, in which an AI is to be created that manages to analyze and interpret a literary text as convincingly as a human, which is a fine variation of the Turing test, of course, that Simone spoke about just a moment ago. Secondly, then, I will discuss literary work created by an AI. From early computer-generated poetry and fiction to contemporary writing using bots and other technology to compose literature. And you can see some examples of this on the slide here, then, from one early example from the 1950s and one recent one. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I will approach literature as such, as an alien and artificial intelligence, and as a form of programmable medium. Verse, for instance, poetic programs from hexameter to sonnets display how literary language is far from a natural human expression, but always external and artificial. As Avery Slater suggests in an article on machine translation, poetry is a non-human product of an immanent property of language itself. And naturally, language is a technical prosthesis. Perhaps there is no other intelligence than the artificial one. In other words, literature can function not only as an archaeological probe that historicizes media generally, but also reconfigure and problematize the recent and current discussions of AI. And I here align with Joanna Zielinska's reading in her recent book, AI Art, Machine Visions and Warped Dreams, where she wants to confront the binary strictures regulating much writing on AI. And I quote her here, and instead of pitching the human against the machine, proposes to see different forms of human activity, including art, as having always been technical. And finally, if I have the time, I'm not sure about the time. Do I have one more minute? Okay. Finally, if I have the time, then yeah. When I began to read the previous speaker's recent book, your new book, Simone's new book on deceitful media last week, I realized there might be another road to follow here. When Simone writes in the introduction to his book that in order to understand the relation between deception and AI, we need to look at the history of theater, painting, and cinema. I was also reminded of Kittler's famous media history of literature and his literary history of media, according to which the hallucinatory medium romantic poetry gave way to the modernist play with discrete signs. And perhaps one more facet of the story of literature and AI can be observed and explored here, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jesper. Wonderful. So next up is Hanna Pelikan, who's a PhD candidate in language and culture at Linköping University. In her thesis, She focuses on sound resource for human-robot coordination. Her work contributes to the design of human-friendly robots that respect human interaction practices and thereby are more intuitive to interact with. So Hannah, take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I will share my slides. Can you see them? Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I feel very honored to be invited here. As Lina already said, I'm a PhD student in language and culture, and my focus is sort of on the language side of that. So I work mostly on robots, and the approach that I take is ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. We really study interaction between humans and robots, looking at sort of situated everyday encounters and how people then sort of talk and interact with robots on a moment by basis. So I really look at video data and look at it in very fine detail to understand how people do that. My background is in cognitive science and human-computer interaction, so it took me quite a route to get to this field. And I'm very curious about how humans interact with robots, as I said, but also how we can design robots so that they're easier to interact with. That interaction is sort of smooth and follows human interaction patterns. And I think that this is quite important so that actions are kind of becoming recognizable. They don't need to be sort of robots. I'm not saying robots should sort of behave in the exact same way as humans, but they need to do actions that are kind of recognizable so that they are, in a sense, if you will, sort of like human friendly. Otherwise, you end up, if you kind of let people just adapt to the robots, you end up in the worst case with people in cages and kind of having to wear sensors so that the robots can recognize them, as is currently done in the Amazon warehouses. So there is also a bit of an ethical dimension in this, I think. I thought I would just kind of present a few projects that I've worked on to give you a flavor of my work. This is work that I've done for my bachelor thesis, which was published at the sort of most prestigious human-computer interaction conference. Here we demonstrated that humans adapt to the emerging interactional capabilities of a now robot. And we found that people use quite similar strategies when they talk to this quite limited robot as we do when we normally talk to non-native speakers, for example. I've done a bit of work on surgical robots. This was during a research stay at Cornell University in the US, where I looked at how surgical robots impact teamwork. And this is a picture of normal surgery without a robot, where you can see that the team is really close together and they kind of can see each other. They actually touch each other quite a bit. But when you introduce the Da Vinci surgical system, which you can see on the left, this sort of like huge white thing, you get the surgeons actually removed from the patient who is by the robot, and the surgeons sit on the right in these goggles. So it's much more like an office setting, actually. And my work investigated how the robot changes communication and affect in the surgical team. And we documented the practices that the surgical teams develop then to deal with this physical distance that is imposed by the robot and how they change their communication. My PhD project is focusing on sound, so how we can coordinate human and robot bodies through sounds. And my supervisors are Professor Lelo Kevalek and Professor Matthias Bruder. I am employed in a project by the Swedish Research Council on so-called non-lexical vocalizations. This is Lelo's project, and this is about sort of sounds that you typically don't find in the dictionary. There's kind of ooh, ah, can also be kind of grunts, all kinds of interesting sounds. And the larger part of the project focuses on human sounds, but my work kind of looks at how we could use such minimal sounds in robots to communicate better. And again, like this is not so much looking into kind of picking the identical sounds from humans, but sort of like finding equivalents in robots that could work in similar ways. And as I have sort of indicated here with the term body, is like I see sound very much as a multimodal resource that is kind of connected to the body. I've been working with a Cosmo robot. It's a small toy robot that I studied in family homes. It has quite advanced sound design, so it's actually really interesting to study how these sounds already work quite well to communicate, but also how they could be improved. For example, there's a specific sound that was intended to display sort of sadness, for example. And we found that this also has implications. It's not just sort of like a funny gadget, but it kind of impacts the interaction. If you get a sad sound animation with like kind of like a sad face and everything, people will actually try to repair their actions and go back and try to sort of fix what happened before. So that could also be used in interaction. Another project that I'm working on is on autonomous shuttle buses on Linköping University campus. So at the moment, these are actually not moving so much, but stopping quite a bit. You can see a picture of a stop when the bus is actually overtaken by a cyclist. Because as these buses are new, people find it really hard to understand how they work. So cyclists and pedestrians especially get really close to the sensors who are kind of programmed to stop immediately if there is somebody getting too close to prevent accidents. But this, of course, also happens in situations where it's not a dangerous situation. So I'm kind of trying to map out how cyclists and pedestrians coordinate their movements and how sound could support this coordination so that traffic runs smoother. And I also just recently became collaborator in a larger project that is looking at how we could sort of like support a virtual agent that is part of a group and kind of working in a team. And here I'm interested in how the insights that conversation analysis can give us about interaction can help to decide how this agent should interact at a specific moment in time. So in that project, I'm aiming to integrate my approach even stronger with the design of artificial agents, working on with roboticists and designers. Thank you very much. And I'm looking really forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for a very interesting presentation. Again, with many ties to the previous presenters that we can come back to in our discussion. We're now moving on to Bojana Romic, who is an artist and a media theorist. She's currently the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Seal of Excellence Researcher and Senior Lecturer at Malmö University, working on a project called The Robot as a Technocultural Icon. Her research is situated at the crossroads between audience studies, aesthetics of technology and image politics. Please, Bojana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this interesting event and this debate. And I can see that my project really communicates with the projects of many speakers that presented already, although some of them might find it slightly provocative. And I'm going to explain why. Since we have only 5 minutes, I decided not to share my screen, but I have my slides here, so I'm just going to focus on some of the kind of the main points of my research, and then hopefully we are going to have a little bit more time to discuss it. So as mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in media and communication at School of Arts and Communication at Malmö University, which means that my research kind of stems from media and communication studies. However, since my research is called The Robot as a Technocultural Icon, since I started working on it, I kind of embraced science and technology studies approach in my research. Just for those of you, I can see that many of you are familiar, but some may not be. So I'm just going to kind of briefly run through some of the kind of a main foci of this approach. So science and technology studies approach considers historical situatedness of technological artifacts. So every technological artifact has its very specific history. So when we say artificial intelligence, it has been decided at a very precise moment of time. In this case, after the Second World War, when many researchers from Stanford University returned to the US and became kind of inspired by some already existing technologies, war technologies, and then applied them to this kind of a new field of research. So today, this research still kind of carries the traces of those decisions that are made back then. So this is just an example really of that kind of a historicity of a specific technological artifact. Furthermore, STS approach emphasizes kind of a structuralism, meaning relationship to a broader system, how this particular technology is embedded and how it communicates with other artifacts. And finally, something that I'm especially kind of intrigued about is what language are we using to describe phenomena? And that's something that I, as a media and communication studies scholar, that's something that I really consider very important. And the reason why is because I believe it shapes our socio-technological imaginary. I'm borrowing here the term by Sheila Yasanov, and her definition of socio-technical imaginary is the collectively held, institutionally stabilized, and publicly performed visions of desirable futures, animated by shared understandings of forms of social life and social order, attainable through and supportive of the advances in science and technology. This is a really, really long sentence, but in other ways, the way we talk about things actually shapes, especially public imaginary of those, in this case, technological artifacts. Oh, I have 1 minute and 47 seconds. So my research here focuses specifically on drawing robots, and you will notice that I'm using the term drawing robots instead of creative robots. The reason why I'm doing it, because I'm trying to avoid so-called intentionalist vocabulary, and that's something that Johannes from Aarhus University wrote about. The idea is that we try to avoid terms, kind of a very pregnant terms such as think of work when we discuss machines, because again, it can add that surplus of meaning. I found that kind of language which leads into kind of some kind of myth of the machine. This is another point that I want to emphasize, even in works of some researchers that are kind of already examined this problem for 10 years or so. For example, Arthur Miller, that 2 years ago published a book, Artist in the Machine. He wrote on page 28, AlphaGo knew that this move is going to kind of phase Lee Sedol. So AlphaGo didn't know anything. So that kind of a language is an example of an intentionalist language. And I hope that we'll have a chance to discuss it a little bit. Just really quickly, Myth of the Machine kind of discusses technology as a mythical other. And I'm referring to Johannes Urinska, like one of the previous presenters. And that's the premise on a rather unsophisticated model of the human as a self-enclosed non-technological entity involved in the eternal battle with techne. So we cannot really, this is really my wrap up, we cannot really completely separate the technology of the humans from history of the humans from histories of the technology. They're deeply intertwined. And when we research those, we should acknowledge that. Thank you.
Warm thanks, Bojana. Wow, I do want to hear more about this with avoiding intentionalist vocabulary, because that is such a rich philosophical thing and so super exciting. Now, dear all, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you all our last speaker of today. So please let us warmly welcome Jenny Sundén, who is professor now at Karlstad University. And Jenny's work is situated in the intersection of digital media studies, cultural studies, science and technology studies, feminist and queer theory, and affect theory. Currently, she works on questions of technological brokenness, disruption, and delay as a contribution to queer theory and to queer lives, as well as, of course, to feminist uses of humor as a form of resistance in, for instance, social media, and also focusing on humor and laughter and how that may rewire shame and acts of shaming. So without further ado, give a warm welcome to Jenny.
Thank you, Cici. Thanks for having me. I mean, this is wonderful. And let's just say that, well, I guess I've done sort of feminist and queer post-humanist media and technology studies for a couple of decades, I guess, trying to find progressively better moisturizers along the way. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so my interest here today is in the future of AI pleasure and sex tech from a social justice perspective. And mainly, I mean, against the background of how gender and sexuality really have been an intrinsic part of how machine intelligence has been imagined already from the beginning. So one obvious example would be how gender appeared as part of the original Turing test, which I saw that Simone, there is this gender discussion running in the chat already. So it sort of links back to that. And for sure, sex tech is a multi-billion industry, right? And one that has also significantly expanded during the pandemic. So in public discussions of sex tech and AI, the focus is primarily on where the money goes, so to speak, on sex robots, as either this utopian promise of unlimited future sexual possibilities, or as a dystopian threat, really, which sort of normalizes objectification, misogyny, and sexual violence. And sex robots also tend to be predictably, let's say, hyper-sexualized, built to please at least an imagined straight male user. But taking the cue from AI ethicist and sex robot expert Kate Devlin, I'm more interested in exploring these sort of future directions in sex tech and AI within sexual encounters that are more than human, or more to the point, more than human-like, right? So in alternative algorithmic imaginaries, if you like. So Devlin envisions a future of sex tech devices which simulate multiple senses, respond to users in sensual and comforting ways, and which use more unexpected textures and forms like hammocks or tentacles. Let's think outside of the box, she says, or outside of the bot, really. So from a queer, sex-positive feminist perspective, I'd say that the most exciting stuff is indeed happening in the field of non-humanoid sex tech more broadly, on the margins of big sex tech, such as at sex tech hackathons, in female, trans, and non-binary sex tech startups, and in spaces such as the fabulously named annual conference Ars Electronica, which then promotes sexual activism and tech literacy by interrogating the impact of sex on technological innovation. And I mean, we're surely in the domain of devices that already look a bit like alien tech, right? Considering the current market of brightly colored toys. While some are certainly phallic, as that's the shape with certain advantages for many bodies, they're not made to resemble or be mistaken for what someone like Luz Irigaray would call the one of form of the individual, of the male sex organ, of the proper name, of the proper meaning. So take Lioness, which is a smart vibrator and app brand that uses AI, sort of careful biofeedback, precision sensors, and pleasure data to help, as they put it, people, well, in this case, women, to see and improve their orgasms. And then the Brooklyn-based sexual wellness boutique Wildflower, so they have created NB, which is a genderless object named after the acronym NB, short for non-binary, then designed to please a variety of bodies. So the company invites you to, as they put it, write your own sexual script, sort of avoiding the prescriptiveness of more familiar sex toy designs that always make assumptions on race, gender, and ability when it comes to who can use them and how they can be used. I mean, so why bother with pleasure and AI? Well, I mean, so from medical devices in disguise in the early 20th century to liberating and playful political non-human objects as part of the sexual revolution in the 1960s and 70s, to then the present mainstreaming of toys in all the more networked and intelligent formats. Sex toys have always been these fraught technologies at the intersection of pleasure, sexual norms, morals, and sexual agency. So, I mean, for these reasons, pleasure has been a pretty hot issue and of central sort of feminist importance, essential really to social justice, to liberation, since pleasure, as Adrienne Marie Brown puts it in this sort of popular feminist account, pleasure is a measure of freedom, she says. So Brown emphasizes the many ways in which people of color, sex workers, queer, trans, and non-binary people have been denied pleasure, and why it's necessary to focus on their pleasure, on our pleasure, as a principle of organization and mobilization. And I would add, as a design principle in technological innovation, in this effort to make the future of embodied and sexy forms of AI not only more diverse and inclusive, but a little more interesting. And just briefly to round off, this is like a small part of a larger project where it's at the stage of a project application that we have entitled Reimagining Artificial Intelligence in the Nordics: Agency, Resistance, Hope. And this is the list of people that are included in this exciting plan for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny, for that intriguing presentation of pleasure and AI. A lot to think about, and very interesting new aspects I think we can come back to in the discussion. And also, of course, thank you to all of you speakers. I'm full of impressions and ideas and overwhelmed by the brilliance of your presentations, really. And now it's time for us to come back to them, to sort through them, to get down to them. I could talk for half an hour about all of your presentations and so on, but I will not, because I'm here to host and to help everyone else discuss. So I will just start taking a question from the chat, and Lina and I will take turns in picking them up. So please keep questions coming in the chat, and I would also suggest if we direct a question to someone, we will take the liberty to do that also. And you feel that you want to come into the discussion during this question, then raise your hand and we will try to let you in doing that, because there are many topics on the table now and there are many ways we could organize this. But since we're using the chat, we'll start with the chat and go that way. So the first question that I took note of from the chat was directed to Andrea from Carolina, and the question was, what is your answer for the really popular question related to AI? Is AI able to create art? Is the AI activity a creative process? So Andrea, would you care to expand on these popular questions on creativity and how to understand it in AI?
Well, I mean, that's, first of all, I think the notion of creativity, I mean, there has been the conference for computational creativity around now for many, many years. And still the notion of how to define that is actually under a vivid discussion there. So I mean, that's of course at the core of the thing, what we actually conceive of as being creativity here. But I mean, I just answered to that question very quickly, yes and yes, because depending on the context and on the specific art form, yes, an AI can create an art that can be considered as creative, in the sense that a human being interacting with the outcome or with the process of, let's call it creating this thing, may conceive of it as something that is inspiring, that is original, and that drives to maybe new ideas. So in that sense, I think it can already now work. But then the formal aspect is, of course, that all the AIs work in very, very constrained artistic context. So, I mean, we have an AI that has been trained to generate specifically Irish folk tunes, which would not be able to generate a whatever, just name a country next to it, folk tune. It would not work. So we have this very much specialist thing. So it, in a very specific framework, in a very specific artistic context, that can work. But it's an interesting question how to embrace the huge diversity that is there in human expression. That is a tricky issue. So we have, as in all the gaming AIs, we have specialist tools that can play chess or solve whatever other specific context, but they are not intelligent in any way in the larger sense. They can work in a very specific context.
Thank you so much. We have tons of really fascinating questions. So I'm sorry for sort of speeding the Q&A as well, since we already sort of stressed you in the presentations. But I see some of you already answered the questions in the chat, but I want to give you the opportunity to sort of explain to us all. So Johannes asked Åsa, do you see a potential in AI augmented feminist queer theory? And is this something you're interested in?
Yes, as I think I wrote, I think it depends on how you define what augmented means, and also maybe potential as well. So I think I would like to know more.
Yes. Thank you so much. I wrote then afterwards that I think maybe augment is not the right word, but I'm thinking more about actually, and I haven't said this before, about algorithms and models. So these can be, I think, experimental media of where you can implement queer and feminist theory, understandings of care, for instance. Because currently, I think much of the discourse focuses on data, but I think there's also a discourse about models to be had, about what these algorithms can do, and you know, that was kind of my question, I guess. And I pointed to the work of Kara Keeling because she has this understanding of using technology to master's discontent. So not stepping away from the technologies and of master's tools completely, but actually just turning them against the original idea, basically.
Yes, and I think that's very interesting in how I don't look so much at how like the end user or how these technologies are actually creatively being implemented in different situations so much, but because I'm interested also in this idea of like basic research not having an impact on like the limitations that are created for these later steps, if you say so. But I think you can do a lot of like things with this, but I'm interested in how some speakers talked about today, like the history and how certain ideas and conventions of techno science are like still persisting in these technology designs and how they perceive of the human. And I was very interested in this idea of, because that's also something that I have, that is part of my thesis, how they enact the human, and with a big H. It's like, yeah, and that's something that I'm interested in. But of course, there are ways that we can like disrupt this in other places and so on, but I'm interested like how the AI researchers themselves enact AI.
Thank you, Johannes, for the question and also for the answer. I also found that question very, very interesting and intriguing, and we could talk more about it. I think there could be a huge potential in trying to kind of tweak algorithms and models using non-normative thought, queer theory, indigenous thinking, and so on, to see what happened. Because as it is, these systems are usually informed by very normative thinking, and that's what we see reproduced, right? So I think that's a really, really good point that you raised. I saw a raised hand before from Jesper, but then I don't know if it's lowered. Jesper, if you want to say something, speak now or wait.
Yeah, I had a comment, thank you, in relation to what Andres said about creativity and Carolina's question about creativity and art in relation to AIs. And I was thinking there, that depends, of course, on how you define creativity and what is that really. And I began to think then about Luciana Paris's discussions on how AIs today can actually do what she calls an alien epistemological production, actually do something on their own, so to speak, that is not dependent on the human programming and so on. And she has quite a dense philosophical argument leading up to that claim, so I can't really repeat it here. But I think that's an interesting take on AIs today, that where you can see that but that depends, of course, on that you also see the AI is doing something else than the human, you know. So, and then the AI can also become, you know, generative of something more original, something really alien, that actually, which is kind of similar to how we conceive of at least modern literature and art, you know, as doing something new, or defamiliarize our everyday lives and our knowledges and so on. So I think she has a really interesting take on this question. Thanks.
Thank you, Jesper, for that comment. And I see Cecilia Magnusson also raised her hand, so please, Cecilia, go ahead.
Thank you. Just a very brief point from the horizon of law in a broad sense, and there is a history of discussing creativity, originality. I'm sure you know quite a lot about it, much more than I do, because I'm not an IP lawyer. But what might be interesting to be aware of is the fact that there is a growing, I would say, interest within the legal domain among legal professionals and legal scholars, not least, investigating into, from a copyright point of view, from the point of intellectual property rights, these new means for creativity. So what I can see is a more matured cross infrastructural discussions and analysis. So I think that the legal domain has more interesting aspects to contribute with than just a couple of decades ago. So there's more to find if you go into the domain of law, I would say. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you
so
much, Cecilia.
Yeah, I think I would pick up the next question, Lina, and it's actually for Cecilia, so you can stay with us, keeping your microphone on. And it's also a very interesting question that Johannes raised. I'm also wondering, really curious to hear what you would have to say about. And he's asking if you had a chance to look at the new European Union AI regulation principles that was leaked, I think, a couple of days ago. And for context, for those of you who are not really invested in the policy making around AI, the US and China, for instance, have not been very strict with the regulations on AI use and so on, rather speeding on in the so-called AI arms race to go ahead, whereas the European Union has, for the last couple of years, emerged as a global player who is keen to regulate AI more strictly, to try to make it more equitable, to try to save some aspects of it. But it's very challenging. But it actually had European Union officials courted by Google and Facebook and other leading companies, heads of companies coming here to try to convince them to not make the regulations too strict because they believe it would damage their development or perhaps business models. But please, Cecilia and everyone else who is interested in this aspect, let's talk about it for a second.
Thank you, and it certainly is a very interesting development. Maybe Tassie can supplement it. I haven't had time to go into the text in detail, but of course I know about the problem being addressed. I think it's challenging. I think there is reason for quite a few stakeholders to be aware of what's going on. Historically speaking, attempts to regulate technology has, generally speaking, I would argue, been a failure. I mean, technological development will go on regardless of lawmakers trying to regulate such a core aspect of our whole society. And personally, not having had time to go through the contents in detail, I find it quite almost provocative to categorize AI in different risk categories, actually. And I mean, we all know, you all know better than I, that AI is not easily defined. You can define AI, of course, in a certain context. But I mean, also what I was indicating in my brief slide presentation is that, I mean, how do we relate AI to other kinds of automation? So risky business, I would say, to go and regulate different categories of AI, and a very important discussion to follow, not least from the point of view of the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, and how does those regulatory frameworks, how do they match? So I think it is quite challenging, and we should also move lessons learned in terms of earlier attempts to regulate, and we have issues of explainability. I mean, we have, there's going to be so many PhD projects potentials coming out of this. That's going to be my bottom line right now. Thanks.
Thank you, Cecilia, for that comment. I think that there's as you say, it's really, really challenging, and of course the GDPR, which came as an attempt to regulate issues of concern, have now largely, according to some commentators, become a kind of something that you could use to actually exploit more than you could before, because you have people sign without actually reading through this. This is a GDPR statement that we put in, that we also have you accept whatever use we make of the data and so on. So it's really challenging.
May I just say one more thing? No, it's quite interesting that the GDPR conventionally is presented in terms of data protection, privacy protection, etc. Of course, in that I mean, there is this human rights perspective, no doubt. But if you read narrowly the provisions, you see that the other purpose with the GDPR is to facilitate personal data transfers on the digital market. So we have the privacy perspective, but we also have the explicit commercial one. And I'm just waiting, when will the commercial aspect of GDPR be explored?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Cecilia. I think that some scholars working on data colonialism, like Nick Coldry and others, made a comparison of GDPR statements with what early modern colonialists would present to indigenous peoples as legal statements of the right to claim the land, that regardless of if they understood or not, they said that we now have the right to claim what we are claiming, and GDPR seems to have this kind of hidden text. But we should move on, and unless someone else wanted to come into this discussion, I think Lina should take the next question.
Teresa, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. And also, I'm curious to know, when it comes to aspects in higher education, what would you say is the worst case scenario?
Oh, wow. Yes. Yeah, thank you, Lina. Now, the first thing, as I was reading AI Ethics by Mark Kokelberg. I don't know if it's a little book. And in relationship to the question that you asked, Adam, to Cecilia, there is a quote from him saying that in spite of cultural differences, it turns out that AI ethics policies are remarkably similar. And I think that says a little bit from, a perspective on situated ethics. I think that's quite weird that we're still thinking in very general terms and not engaging with differences in terms of cultures and histories and geographies, etc. The other question, Lina was asking about what's the mardröm scenario, the nightmare scenario about. Well, I think that says, for me, as the students' autonomy and students' well-being and how we are constructing knowledge in universities. There are so many problems with the universities nowadays. Universities are not focusing really on education, unfortunately. That would the agency of the students and well-being and autonomy. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Should we go ahead with another question, perhaps? This question is from Johannes to, no, we've already discussed that questions, I'm sorry. So Carolina asked Cecilia Magnusson Sjöberg, I'm curious of your work also with the existing of digital presentations of dead people. I mean, algorithms keeping their virtual activity. Is it still a person?
That's an excellent research question. And I know about other researchers taking up the challenges, but I cannot answer. But it is at a quite a high level or a quite general level, it can be noted that coming back to GDPR, that it is applicable on living persons, but in practice, dead people might also indicate personal data to dead people. So it's easier said than done to make a distinction between living and diseased people. Once again, the society does not really the map. I mean, it's easier said than done to design the landscape for this distinction, and it's definitely a research question. And I know research communities working with it, of course, in the context of social media, not the least. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, sorry for not being able to be more informative, but it is definitely relevant and important.
Thank you, Cecilia. I think your former Stockholm University colleague Amanda Lagerqvist, who is now at Uppsala, has worked a lot on this. She has a WASP project now on BioMe, and also collaborating with me with our new project on the Mediated Planet. But if you're interested in mourning and death online, she's one of the researchers who's worked on it. She was supposed to be with us today, but could not make it, unfortunately. But hopefully she will be next time we meet. Moving on with the questions, there was one question for Jesper from Jürgen Ramskogeby. What about machine readings, interpretations of machine-produced literary texts? This is something that Jesper briefly replied to, but I think it ties into the general discussions of AI and creativity, the lines we draw between human and non-human in the production of literary and creative text, so to speak. So perhaps Jesper and maybe then also if Andre and Bojana want to tie into that discussion, it would be interesting to hear more about.
Yes, I responded briefly to Jürgen's question there about, yes, I would also consider in my work that kind of AI generated writing and books, and but also writing generated by machines for machines mainly. And that is more general questions when it comes to representations today. How we but also how we see the world. Nicholas Mirtsov in his latest book, How to See the World, reflects upon this. How do we approach and analyze a cultural situation where overwhelmingly most images today are actually produced by machines for machines and for machine reading, and how do we as humans relate to that? And this ties in also with Jürgen's questions about machine generated writing and machine readings of that writing. So I think that's a really large question that actually goes much further than the question of AI and creativity. Well, I don't know what to say more. Maybe if Jürgen also could add something about those kind of works that he referred to in the question, that would be interesting. If Jürgen is there somewhere.
Well, I was just thinking about the sort of redundancy that this implicates in terms of sort of machine-machine communication, and how, I just thought it would be an interesting perspective to actually see what that generated in terms of just results in this sort of machine.
And this situation, which is a kind of futuristic in a way, or was at least a couple of decades ago, has actually also been reflected upon or like processed in art and in literature. I always mention the work of Christian Böck and his Xenotext project that he initiated almost 20 years ago now, where he writes a poem that is to be inserted into resistant bacteria as a storage and creative medium for the future, for a future reader who we couldn't really imagine, which is of course a conceptual work that reflects upon this situation where representations, verbal and visual representations and so on, are produced and generated all again and again, but for whom and who will process them, and how will that affect life in general on this planet? So it's a really huge question that this opens up, I think. But there are also interesting writers and book designers who work with this today, who actually produce AI generated literary works, which are designed. The books are designed by AIs, and there are published on AI constructed publishers and sold on Amazon and so on. So there are several kind of interesting aesthetic or artistic or literary work going on that tries to explore this general cultural situation, which I find really interesting, and which I will definitely look into if I pursue this that I presented in my.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Jesper.
Thank you. Bojana, would you like to come in and comment on this as well? You had some thoughts also, I think, on these aspects and issues on where we draw the line between the human and the machine and the creativity process.
Drawing a line is actually extremely difficult. What I would say is that we have to acknowledge the whole process when we talk about creation. So one of the things that is rarely mentioned is, for example, the quality of the sample. This is one of the aspects that Joy from the MIT and her story about the sample that kind of excludes black faces and only includes kind of white faces, and on the basis of that, facial recognition technology has been developed. The same thing happens also when you work on other forms of kind of AI training. So what I think is actually very important is that when we talk about AI generated literary works or other types of creation, we have to acknowledge this human machine assemblage and insist on it, because if you say this has been made by AI only, you kind of you truncate associated humans, so to say, and that distorts the picture of the whole process, because the process is not it doesn't start from the moment that a machine has a certain sample to work with. It starts with the actual creation of the sample. So I think the acknowledging the whole process is extremely important, and be transparent about it, because that way we learn about this kind of a very fragile dynamic between humans and a machine, and also we avoid kind of exoticizing the machine in the process, because human-machine collaboration is not a new thing. It's been going on for 100 years at least in artistic artworks. So I think that being kind of a very precise about it is actually helpful for this kind of narrative. I hope I answered your question. I'm happy to clarify.
Thank you.
Can I just
Thank
comment
you.
on
Yes,
that?
Sure. Jesper, go ahead.
Yes. I just want to say that I completely agree with Bojana. That's really crucial that you don't simplify here, that you don't do this binary between human and machine. And it's really important that you also mentioned in your presentation earlier that we look into the history of these intertwinings between man and machine, or human and machine, and human technology. That's crucial. That's what I think is so important with Johanna Zelinska's recent work on AI as well. We have to historicize AI today and to do a materialist analysis of it all the time. So that's why I think also media archaeology is an important take on approaching the whole discourse on AI and the practice of it today. So yeah, so I completely agree with Bojana there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear more from you, Hannah, about this, since we have also several questions about this human-machine interaction in the chat. For example, do you think machine-machine communication will take on a new post-humanist direction? Seeing how we develop AI to mimic human communication patterns, we will also see machine communication with each other through a proxy of human-based grammar to keep humans sort of in the loop.
Well, I think this actually ties in very nicely to what Bojana just said, that of course there is always sort of like a programmer involved. So I think we have to acknowledge that maybe the first sort of computers, they were kind of running on a very kind of machinic way of communicating, sort of like zeros and ones in a sense. But then the way that programming languages have evolved, I would say, like they become more and more available for end users. And nowadays we have even these like, drag and drop interfaces where anybody can program basically. So I think from that perspective, I would say that machines are already sort of like communicating sort of in a very sort of like, just programming is a way that is sort of like built for humans. So that's what I would say from a technical background. Then of course, between machines, if you use sort of like human-made programming languages, I think that's also like, again, there is sort of like a human element in there. So I think we can't kind of take that away and just assume that it's only the machines that are kind of communicating with each other, because they are built by some person who kind of like made that. So I think it's really interesting to think about it further, and I kind of see very much that I come from a rather technical background here, I guess, and like having programming experience myself. But I hope that it's I think it would be interesting to discuss further what it means.
Thank you, Hannah. A very interesting discussion, and I'm trying to pick up some other questions that may tie into this in a different way. And we have had a couple of questions to Simon about basically Lina Henriksen asked if you could say a little more about how you understand the approach to deception of AI, and then Tisha Hapkes, I will put these two questions together. Wanted to know more also about the implication of the Turing test and who defines the intelligence, so to speak, and how you see the relationship between human and machine in that. So Simon, would you like to develop on those questions?
Thank you very much, Lina and Tisha, for these questions. Well, the topic, and by the way, Lina, I'd be really interested to read your paper. So if you could share with me, I would be really happy. say that the usual approach to the topic of deception in AI is to distinguish very rigidly between the so-called real AI and deceptive AI, so something that is actually appears to be AI but is not AI. And I think that this approach is not productive because it doesn't consider that AI is ingrained. Deception is ingrained in AI. Deception is a structural component that is central to AI as much as the circuits and the software that make AI run. And in this, I link to research about the topic of deception. For instance, there is a great book that came out a couple of years ago by Donald Hoffman, a psychologist, called The Case Against Reality, that he underlines the deception is a from our perception, and I can make a walking in the wood, and I see something.
I think the connection is kind of lagging. The last maybe 30 seconds or so were a bit lost on me. I don't know if it was the same for everyone. I think so.
So I was saying that I'm linking in the in research that recently has underlined how deception is cannot be separated from the so-called normal perception. For instance, there is a great book that is called The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman, a psychologist, who just to make an instance, let's say that I walk in the wood and I see something that I feel it's an animal or something. Yeah, then I turn my head and I notice that it's actually just a bush with a strange form. Yeah, and of course I am deceived in this moment, but this very same deception in another situation could have helped me to prevent a potential danger. Yeah. So deception is part of how we perceive the world, and there's a functional role. And AI technologies, when they enter communications with humans, always mobilize kind of deception. I call it banal deception because it is something that is part of our everyday life. It's ordinary, and it's not usually perceived as such, perceived as deception. But it doesn't mean that it is not very consequential. So for instance, and I can talk this about also Tisha's question about implications. For instance, voice assistance technology. Companies such as Amazon, Apple have made very clear choices about how to the voice of these assistants. These choices were based on consideration about how people perceive different voices. For instance, how a gender can attract a specific projection rather than other gender. It's most important to say that these assumptions may be totally wrong, but still are made based on a consideration about how people perceive and react to specific stimulation. Another example of the implication is the topic of creativity. Andrea already has mentioned that creativity is also something that relates to how we perceive something as creative. And there are ways in which we can predict how something can be perceived as more creative than other things. For instance, there are some examples of AI art, so-called, so you have this AI-generated artwork that is exhibited in a gallery. Or now, of course, an art gallery is a place that already, because of the institutional working of art and because of how we are used to see and consume art, is something that stimulates an attribution of artistic value to an object. So this is also something that, in the sense, we don't. The broad implication of my work is that we shouldn't just consider how the technology develops, but we also should consider how specific perception and reactions of AI are integrated with the technology to make it work towards specific effects, such as towards, for instance, having domesticating voice assistant in a domestic environment so that it doesn't seem it can be more easily appropriated to our family and to our everyday life, or towards attributing creativity to artworks based on specific reasons, that are stimulated.
Thank you, Simon. I think Johannes has raised his hand and wanted to come into the discussion. Johannes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I totally agree with you, Simona. And I think especially Turing, I mean, he was using deception or obfuscation against authorities, right? Against the bobbies, as he said, fool the bobbies who were after him and wanted to try and catch him in the act, right? And I think to have this conversation about creativity and intelligence, whether or not artificial intelligence is intelligent or creative, you also need to historicize the concept of creativity, which is an invention of the 20th century, I would say. And of course, the conception of intelligence, which has been used to differentiate between groups of people. Like if you look at Stanford Binet test, for instance, that was a racist instrument of differentiating between white supremacists and Mexicans and Black people and BIPOC people. And I think also the work of Lisa Nakamura is really helpful here when she talks about indigenous circuits. So the intelligence of Navajo women who were working in electronics manufacture versus the white masculinist coders who were more used to be planning or not used to, but described as planning, organizing, whereas the Navajo women were conceived as being able to work with patterns and with care, right? All these differentiations that have been made in the name of creativity and intelligence, those should be historicized, and maybe AI can help actually do that, I think.
Thank you, Johannes and Simon, for these questions. We could go on talking about deception, but we don't have more time, so we have to move on. Lina, would you like to pose the next question? Perhaps the final one, I don't know, probably looking at the time. Those of you who want to stay for a few minutes extra can absolutely do that, but we have to also, go. So Lina, do you want to?
Yes, we want to be careful of your time, of course, but I would like to take this final minutes to ask a question to Jenny. So Jenny, you said that the sex industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. To what extent does the commercial aspects of new sex tech pose risks for the consumer, do you think? Will they also constitute sensors into data about the human body, for example?
What kind of risks are you thinking of?
Well, I mean, any kind of risks in this.
No, but I mean, of course, I'm just thinking about how toys right now are becoming more and more connected and networked in ways that, of course, I mean, open up bodies, but also open up bodies as data in a way in their linkages to corporate networks. And I mean, there have been some pretty major lawsuits. There's this Canadian company, WeVibe, that got in trouble because they collect this data, and people were quite upset because they felt that they were exposed, right? And I mean, the data in question, it wasn't even personal data. It was more about the when and where and the timing and the body temperature. But so it depends on how sensitive you are in terms of having that kind of data made public, right? So, but I take inspiration from someone like Wendy Chang when she theorizes. I mean, or having us think of how we may want to think less about sort of rights to privacy in a way, and more think about sort of more rigorous public rights, since I mean, we're already, I mean, it's a kind of privacy, online privacy is an illusion in a way, right? So we would be better off to sort of think about collaborative or collective ways of being vulnerable together. And that sex is not a shameful thing, you know? So then the exposure wouldn't be an exposure after all. But so we have a lot to learn, I think, from sort of queer communities and queer politics instead of thinking through collaborative and collective vulnerability online. That would take away a lot of sort of power in acts of slut shaming, for example, or, you know, so yes, public rights.
Thank you so much. And this will end this event, I think. I'm going to turn it over to you, Cecilia, to say something.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for that last important comment, and thank you all. What a start! I'm kind of overwhelmed, to be honest. And you know, all the things that you've been saying has been absolutely amazing. And I've got a new literature tips, stuff that I need to read. And I want to ask you more questions, and I bet that you all feel the same, that you want to dig into more. But now we know each other, so it's a great start. And we've been thinking together here, and as Adam and Lina's already said, this is only the beginning. Adam has mentioned the network, AI and the New Humanities, that we want to inaugurate here. And we have also talked about the anthology that we would like to do together with you all. Now, in the vein of Bojana, I think it's really, really important to acknowledge the whole process. So I would like to thank you all speakers for doing these short, super clever, super intelligent presentations. I would very much like to thank Lina Rahm for curating this event together with me and Adam Wickberg, who's been also co-hosting here. And I would, of course, also like to thank all you participants who've been here attending. And let's not forget, yes, a big, let's not forget another person, Marietta Radomska, who've been kind of facilitating our event also, the electronic bits of this event. So thank you, Marietta, too. But a big warm thank to all you speakers, to all you participants, to Lina, to Adam, to all of you. And let's see each other soon, right? And you will hear from us again. And oh, before we start, I almost forgot. I need to tell you also that the next Posthumanities Hub event is on the 20th of May. But then it is at a more regular for us time. That is 1:15 on the 20th of May. But then we won't be so future oriented. We will actually be both future, and we will actually talk under a project called Checking In with Deep Time. So that we will go into the deep past as well and think about how we today can become better ancestors for future generations. So there is always this temporal connection, right? But my last word is just a big warm thank you. Thank you all so much.